Hi everyone, and welcome to this introduction to India and South Asia. I'm so glad you've joined me here, and a big welcome to you from wherever in the world you're joining me from. I'm Benjamin Siegel, and I'm a historian of South Asia. And over 15 units, I'm going to be taking you from the beginning of human history in the region to the politics, economics, and culture of India and South Asia in the 21st century. It doesn't matter if you know tons about India or nothing at all. By the end of this course, you'll be really conversant with some of the biggest developments in Indian history over the past couple of millennia, and over the past 300 years or so in particular. I'm willing to bet that all of you are here for different reasons. Some of you maybe went on a life-changing trip to the region. Some of you were planning one. Some of you maybe have read something about India, or you've enjoyed some of the region's great fiction. Maybe you've seen a classic Bollywood film like Sholay, or you've caught Sacred Games on Netflix, or you even went to a concert by a group like Red Bharat, or a classical musician like Zakir Hussain. Some of your families may come from the region, maybe you're from there yourself. Whatever your reason is, welcome to this class. I'm really so happy to have you on board. Before we get started, I want something from you. Wherever you're watching this from, take a second, actually take like 5 or 10 seconds, close your eyes, and call to mind an image when I say the word India. I'll wait. Now, when I do this in the classroom, people come up with all sorts of ideas, and maybe there's some of your own. Sometimes they think of the Taj Mahal, or they think of Bangalore, or of Red Fort in Delhi. Sometimes they think of things just abstractly, like crowds, or dirt, or pollution. Sometimes someone calls to mind an elephant, or a camel, or the Himalaya, something from the natural world. Sometimes they picture someone like Gandhi, or they even just picture Gandhi's iconic glasses. And the reason I had you pause for just that second is because everyone comes to a table with a very different idea of what India is, and it's rarely the same idea. So over the next couple of minutes, we're going to think through some of the biggest prevailing ideas about India that have structured some of our thinking, maybe why we think or why we call to mind some of the images we just called to mind. And I want to suggest how this course might help reverse or unpack some of those big ideas. So, all right, what's India? Over the course of this course, we're going to think through this part of the world that we usually define in geographic ways. It's got borders. We think about the borders of India as being the Rann of Kutch, a kind of desert in the western region of the subcontinent. We think of the Himalayas up north, shrouded in snow. We think of the Indian Ocean as a watery boundary, or maybe the marshy areas around Bangladesh. We call it the Indian subcontinent, but really there's nothing sub about it. It's about 2,500 miles east and west by around 2,500 miles up and down, north to south. It's not that much smaller than the European continent. And there's probably around 2 billion people here as of 2020, and that's around a quarter of humanity. There's just as much diversity in this region as there is in Europe, and probably a whole lot more. There's 20 major languages, there's hundreds of smaller ones. There's Hindus of all kinds of persuasions, there's Buddhists, Christians, Zoroastrians, Jews, and about 500 million of the world's 1.7 billion Muslims. Now, politically, of course, if we go to the region, we've got the world's biggest democracy in India, and we've got a lot of other nominal and maybe even functional democracies alongside very serious authoritarian traditions. And sometimes those happen even in the same country. You've got one of the world's fastest growing economies alongside many areas of severe underdevelopment. So all of this should give you the sense that India is really big, and it's bigger than what we can do in 15 lectures, but we're going to give it our best shot. So before that, let's spend a little bit more time thinking through other ways of seeing India. Let's talk about terminology first. When we say India, we might mean different things. We might instinctively, coming from today, think of the Republic of India, which comes into being in August 1947. And we could put that in opposition to Pakistan or Bangladesh with their very different modern histories. But if we went back about a century, we'd be talking instead about British India, and that would comprise India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and before 1935, the modern country of Burma as well. If we went back a couple more centuries, we'd get into this idea of Hindustan, a Persian or an Arab name for the land east of the Indus River. Now, the imagination of Hindustan to Persians and Arabs and Greeks and Romans would have been much bigger than that area we're talking about now, and it would have included the territories of 7 modern nation-states: the republics of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, the Maldives, maybe even Tibet or Burma, depending on who was making that map. And if we even stretch back further in time, maybe a millennia or so, people thinking about India might have thought about an idea even bigger than territory. They'd be thinking about a bigger Indian civilization, and that would stretch all the way from Asia Minor in the west to Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand in the east. And those are places where Sanskrit, originally a language of sacred life, would become lingua franca for poetry and literature and the arts. So I think this helps to explain some of the fluidity of terms. When we talk about the ancient past over the next 15 lectures, India is going to mean the land and people south of the Himalayas, east of the Thar Desert, and between the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. And it'll be crisscrossed by a series of major rivers and mountain ranges. In the 18th, 19th, 20th century, we're going to use India to mean broadly British India, with its own set of expanding and changing boundaries. We're going to get more careful when we get to 1947. India is going to come to mean the Republic of India, and we're going to speak separately of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other nation states. We're probably not in the next 15 lectures going to get a whole lot into Nepal or Sri Lanka or the Maldives, but we'll at least touch upon them and bring them into the larger stories of the Indian subcontinent in a comparative sense. So India, again, it's an ambiguous term, and it's okay that we're using it kind of interchangeably with South Asia. It's been used differently by Greeks, by Arabs, Persians, Chinese speakers, English speakers, to discuss this big, massive part of the world. Let's try another approach. Later in the semester, we're going to talk about Jawharlal Nehru. Some of you may already know him, and some of you are going to meet him for the first time. By the end of the course, you'll have a good sense of who he is and what his thinking was. Nehru was born in the Indian city of Allahabad in 1889. He goes to the Harrow School and Trinity College at Cambridge in the United Kingdom, and he trains, like a lot of Indian nationalists, we'll get to this, to become a lawyer. He becomes the leader of one of the left wings of the Indian Congress, and he really dominates Indian politics in the 1930s. He goes to jail between 1942 and 1946 in his role in the Quit India movement. Again, we're going to get to that. And he spends those 3 years writing in jail. One of the big things that he writes from his prison cell is a book called The Discovery of India. And it's a big book. It's a review of Indian history, philosophy, and culture. It's also a political document, and we're going to get to it later. But in this book, he's thinking about the future of the Indian nation, and he asks a couple of important questions. He says, what was this India that possessed me and beckoned to me continually? What is this India apart from her physical and geographic aspects? What did she represent in the past? What gave strength to her then? How did she lose that old strength? And has she lost it completely? Does she represent anything vital now apart from being the home of a vast number of human beings? How does she fit into the modern world? Now, Nehru, we have to back up. He finds himself a little bit lost when he's in India, talking with peasants and farmers. And this makes a lot of sense because Nehru has spent most of his formative years and his training in Great Britain, and his experience is pretty disconnected from what's been going on in India in the meantime. He says that when he's talking to peasants and farmers across India, when he's back in the subcontinent, he wants them to see India as a whole. And everywhere he goes, he says that he hears this one cry, Bharat Mata Ki Jai, says, victory to Mother India. And he asks, who is this Bharat Mata? Who is this Mother India? Now Nehru, as he does, comes up with a theory. He says there's little in common to outward seeming between the Patan of the northwest and the Tamil in the far south. They differ in their face and figure, their food and clothing, and of course, their language. But, he says, there's no mistaking the impress of India on the Patan, as this is obvious on the Tamil. Nehru here is talking about different ethnic groups, and he has this sense that India is impressed upon them in this ineffable, indescribable kind of way. He says that, of course, different ethnicities in India have retained very different characteristics. But he writes that they're all distinctively Indian, with the same national heritage and the same set of moral and mental qualities. And Nehru contends that India takes in outsiders, and he makes them Indian, regardless of whatever their faith or their ethnic background. He says that those arriving in India who professed a religion of non-Indian origin or coming to India settled down there become distinctively Indian in the course of a few generations, such as Christians, Jews, Parsis, Muslims. Indian converts to some of these religions never cease to be Indians on account of a change of their faith. So for Nehru, India makes other people Indian. You arrive in the Indian subcontinent, and over time, in a few generations, the mark of India is upon you. That's one kind of large, capacious way of looking at India. Let's take a couple others. We've got that idea that India has something special in its soil, something in the region itself that makes insiders out of people who were formerly outsiders. Let's get a little more literal. I think it's really impossible to understand South Asia without understanding its climate, the physical space that creates this region, and how the landscape itself has been used and has shaped Indian civilization. We'll go really far back first. India comes into being when a big triangle of rocky land, which unsurprisingly gets called the Indian Plate, breaks off from East Africa. It starts to move around 140 million years ago, give or take, and it moves incredibly fast by tectonic standards, around 8 inches a year. And this is faster than any other tectonic plate. It slams into Asia, right into the Eurasian plate, sometime between 55 to 50 million years ago. So in planetary terms, pretty recently. What results, of course, if you can imagine, is the Himalayas. There's this violent crashing, there's pushing, land moves upwards, there's volcanoes that spew ash out of the plates and then they get carried off by rain. There's melting ice, water crashes down from the new mountain range, and it makes the Indus, the Ganges, and the Brahmaputra rivers, the big estuarial deltas of modern South Asia. Silt comes down and it forms the Bengal Delta, which is the last of the four. All of this movement, which again takes place around 50 to 55 million years ago, makes for three very distinct geographic regions in India. The first is the Deccan. It's the major part of the triangular Indian plate. It's a big plateau in the center of the country with hilly ridges that run parallel to the coasts. They're called the Eastern and the Western Ghats. The coastal districts are extremely wet because of the monsoon rains, and we'll get to the monsoon momentarily. The interiors are dry, and so agriculture really in the Deccan takes place on the coast. And then there's that little island of Sri Lanka, which used to be connected by a land bridge less than 25 miles away from the mainland of the Indian subcontinent. If we go further north, we've got the Himalayas. And the Himalayas come from a Sanskrit word. It means the abode or the dwelling of snow. These, of course, are the biggest mountains in the world. You've got Everest, you've got K2, a climber's paradise, and it stretches around 5 miles above sea level. The Himalayas are still rising a couple of millimeters each year, and they form a kind of natural boundary between India and the rest of Asia, but it's not an impermeable barrier. And we know that because there's pockets of Sino-Tibetan Chinese languages that are spoken on the southern side of the Himalayas. Then there's the Khyber Pass and the Bolan Pass, where India links up to Afghanistan. And from there to Central Asia, Silk Road, Europe, the Middle East. This is the way that India connects to the rest of the world. Finally, we've got the Indo-Gangetic Plain. This is the basin of 3 great rivers, the Indus, the Ganges, and the Brahmaputra. Because of the ash in these rivers and the alluvium, it's a really fertile soil. So there's amazing agriculture here, or at least the possibilities for it, and it becomes a major center of human population. Nowadays, there's around 1 billion people who make their living off this land. Now, the 1 billion people living on this land and all the other lands of India have to eat something. So when we think of India, as in many other parts of the world, we think of an agricultural society, characterized by the cultivation of crops off the land. And of course, for agriculture, there's one thing that's more important than anything else, and that's water. In some ways, you could tell the entire story of Indian agriculture and maybe even the foundations of Indian civilization as a story of water. The rise of big populations is directly tied to the availability of water. When you have water, you can have agriculture. When you have that, you can have big populations. And when you have big populations, you can eventually have a complex social structure and culture. When you have a surplus of crops because of water, you can have kings, queens, priests, palaces, temples, monasteries, everything that gives to the rise of civilization. Now, there's one major source of water that we've talked about already, and those are rivers. If you go to the north, you have big, constant sources of water, or mostly constant, in the form of three major rivers and their tributaries. You have the Bengal Delta, the Punjab, which is a Persian root meaning 5 rivers, and the Doab, or 2 rivers. These regions form the core of North Indian civilization. South Indian civilization is a little bit harder to sustain in agricultural terms because there's not as much water coming down from the Ghats. But there is another big source of water in South Asia, and we know of it if we think about it. It's the monsoon. The monsoon characterizes rain and seasonality in India. It comes from the southwest and it moves to the northeast, and it's formed by circulating air currents that move in the Indian Ocean. The monsoon gives for a very distinct mix. There's 3 seasons. There's a cold season in South Asia, there's a hot season, and then, of course, the rainy season. When there's no rain, you've got to find ways to control that water. And the way of doing that is by irrigation. For much of Indian history, irrigation has been done by humans or by animals. Now it's done by tube wells and other more complex modern operations. But of course, where there's the monsoon, it doesn't move evenly across the subcontinent. So there's wetter areas and drier areas. In places in West India like Rajasthan or Sindh, those are regions that are the driest. The Indus Valley is one of the wettest spots, and so there you get the earliest and most complex social organization. The weather cycle isn't just about environmental qualities, or even the cultivation of crops, but instead it bears directly on how humans live, move, work, and eat. It means that cultivation is really seasonal in South Asia. We don't need to get into all the specifics, though we'll touch on them later, but there are seasons for wheat, barley, rice, and pulses or legumes. And more than structuring what crops get grown and how much, the weather cycle also controls culture. When you've got cool months in the winter, that's time that tends to be easy and calm. The summer is a bit harder. It's time to travel, migrate. You can move livestock into the hills for water and pasture. It's also the time when you see hunger, cholera, smallpox infections, malnutrition, scavenging. Summer is the time that the most number of wars break out. Loans get collected under duress. And towards that end, there's always preparation for the rainy season of the year. The rainy season changes everything. Food comes into abundance, the prices of food drop, surpluses get collected, there's feasts, there's festivals, and food begins to take on its biggest symbolic meaning. So I really think you can't understand South Asia without understanding this environment that shapes the entire region. But let me give one more way that we can think about South Asia. We've understood the land, but let's think a little bit more about the people who live on it. About a century ago, and in some ways this carries through to the present day, there was a theory of Indian civilization that revolved around really outmoded ideas about race. One antiquated hypothesis held that there was a clash in South Asia between 2 racial or ethnic groups. There was one dark-skinned or seemingly barbarous race, and then there was a light-skinned, civilized race coming from somewhere else. This theory is completely bunk. We do have evidence, however, that the people who we think of as Indian come about through a mix of cultural exchanges. And we know this because of languages. There's 3 big families of languages on the Indian subcontinent. There's Indo-Aryan, there's the Dravidian languages, and there's the Munda languages. The Indo-Aryan languages are all descend from Sanskrit. That's the language of Hinduism's sacred text. They were brought to India by people who called themselves Arya in around 1400 BC. We'll talk about that next time. And it's part of a larger language family called Indo-European. That family branches out into Sanskrit languages, Old Persian and its descendants, and the languages of Europe, including the one we're speaking right now. Big ones that you may know include Hindi and Urdu, which are spoken in the upper Gangetic Basin. Those are really two dialects of the same language written in two different scripts. Hindi is written in Devanagari, and Urdu instead is written in Arabo-Persian, and they're used broadly by Hindus and Muslims, respectively. If we move from west to east across the northern Indian subcontinent, we've got Marathi spoken in Maharashtra, Gujarati spoken in Gujarat, Sindhi spoken in Sindh, Punjabi spoken in Punjab, Nepali spoken in Nepal, Bengali spoken in the modern Indian state of West Bengal and the country of Bangladesh, Oriya spoken in Orissa, and way down in the south, in Sri Lanka, we've got Sinhalese, which is a distant relative of the other Sanskritic languages. The second big language family is Dravidian. Dravidian languages include languages like Tamil, spoken in Tamil Nadu, Telugu, spoken in Andhra Pradesh, Kannada, spoken in Karnataka, and Malayalam, spoken in Kerala. There's about 20 of these languages in total in the Dravidian family, and they were established all over India before the coming of Sanskrit, but they gradually gave way to the predominance of Indo-Aryan languages in the north. Linguists aren't really exactly sure where Dravidian comes from. Some people think that this belongs to the Finno or Ugric family, which includes Finnish. Some think that it has connections to Elamite, which is the ancient language of southwest Iran. There's some broad consensus that it came from the west or northwest, but it's still a little bit something of a mystery. Finally, we've got the Munda languages. And Munda languages in India are primarily tribal ones. They're related to Australo-Asiatic languages. They're spoken in Assam and in Indochina. They're distantly related to Khmer, Chinese, and to a very lesser extent to Vietnamese. The largest language families are Santali, Ho, and Mundari, which are mostly spoken in eastern India. Why am I spending so much time on language here? Well, it's that language gives us some clear linguistic evidence for the diversity of the Indian past and the diversity of Indian ethnicity. It should shy us away from the idea or move us away from the idea that Indian civilization is in some way the product of a single race or two races in conflict or clashing. What we see is a lot of linguistic evidence for different people moving to the Indian subcontinent and sometimes moving away, and for power struggles that led to a modern organization of ethnicities. This is a pretty compelling way of tracing and unpacking the source of Indian populations themselves. So there's a couple different ideas that we've looked at. We've taken a look at a kind of literary idea of what India is. We've looked at the physicality and the climate of the Indian subcontinent. We've looked at languages. So other than a big piece of rock that just one day upped and slammed into the rest of Eurasia, we might be left with this idea that what we call India or South Asia has nothing to do with the other parts. So why is it that we think of India as one place? Is it geography, environment, people? Is there just something ineffable that is shared and makes up India? All of this is important, but I want to give you an idea that I think is particularly compelling. In some ways, India is defined not by those who are on the Indian subcontinent, but by views from beyond the Indian subcontinent. This is an idea that is linguistically available to us in the idea of just that term Indus that gives us India. It's a word that comes from Persian, from someone outside or a group outside of the Indian subcontinent. I'd like to suggest at the beginning of our time together that India has really been defined by its visitors, who lump together disparate populations, different practices, different religious beliefs into a bigger idea, or a couple of competing bigger ideas, and kind of made this place into a discrete geographic entity. There's a lot of evidence for this in different ways. We know that the Greeks knew about India from at least the 5th century BCE. Ptolemy was making maps of it at least as early as the 1st century. Herodotus, the Greek historian, says that India is a land of mostly desert with a vast amount of gold dust. Alexander the Great famously launches a campaign in antiquity to India. He tries to get to the Indus through the Punjab, and he thinks that the end of the world is just 1,000 miles east of where he gets, but he doesn't get further, in part because he's scared about rumors of war elephants. But it's not just from the west that people are looking at India, but from the east. Chinese Buddhist travelers were writing about India from very early on, owing to the religious tradition of Buddhism that came from there. The Buddhist traveler Xuanzang goes to India between 626 and 645 of the Common Era, and he writes a big travelogue called the Great Tang Records on the Western regions. And for him, because India, of course, is the home of Buddhism, he writes of sculptures, of religious lives, of different traditions of religion and culture coming out of India. But there's a host of other visitors whose ideas about India shaped and continue to shape the perception of outsiders. In the European imagination, India is this land of riches. It leads Columbus, of course, to try to sail to India with predictable results. And 5 years after Columbus's arrival in the New World, in 1497, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama lands successfully in Calicut in South India, in what is today Kerala. Everyone was looking for India in the early modern world. But before we tell the story of India, let's talk through one important way that people in the West in particular have conceptualized India. There's others that we're going to get to over the course of the next 15 sessions, but this is the one that I think is good to start with. One of the most important ways that people in Europe and in the West have thought about India comes from James Mill. James Mill is a philosopher and an amateur historian, and he writes A History of British India in 1817. It's a very particular time in the Indian subcontinent. We'll get to why shortly. Mill says he's very proud that he's objective, since he's never been to India and he speaks no Indian languages, so how could he possibly have his opinions tainted? He says that a duly qualified man can obtain more knowledge of India in 1 year in his closet in England than he could during the course of the longest life by the use of his eyes and ears in India. This is a pretty ridiculous idea, but it's one that's pretty pervasive among the group of people that we'll later come to call Orientalists. Mill suggests that there's 3 periods of Indian history. There's an ancient period of cultural production and political stability. He thinks of that kind of as a Hindu period. There's a medieval period of political and cultural chaos and impoverishment of life generally. And he associates that with Muslim rule in South Asia. And finally, because Mill is British, he sees that in the modern world, for him the 19th century, he sees that this is an English period where English know-how and ideas of just administration are going to help rebuild a fallen nation into the glories of its past. These ideas are kind of ridiculous, so it may be confusing as to why I'm bringing them up here. Well, in part this is because Nehru's discovery of India, again, that book that he was writing in jail, patterns itself after John Stuart Mill. So it's one way in which outsiders' ideas of India really come to influence ideas on the Indian subcontinent. Now, when Nehru writes in The Discovery of India, he adds one more period to that different periodization of India. He says that there's a modern or a nationalist period. There's a moment coming up soon when independent India is going to rebuild itself through political, economic, and cultural self-sufficiency. I don't think there's anything wrong with Mill or Nehru's characterization in a chronological sense, but it sets up too many rigid characterizations. The idea of ancient India as an idyllic time, medieval India as a time of decline, and so forth. There's different ideas about religion that I think are pretty offensive to us looking at them now. This kind of periodization is problematic if we take it at face value, so we're going to keep it in mind as a structuring idea even as we avoid it as we go through the last several millennia on the Indian subcontinent. I think it's a little too easy, and maybe some of you did this just now, for us to resort to really quick and easy images about India when we think about this place. Sometimes we get tempted into thinking of India as a place of the exotic, somewhere otherworldly that is mostly available to us as spiritual or cultural. This exotic idea, I don't think is very useful. There's also a prevailing idea that we see in the news a lot of India as poor, as overpopulated, as hungry. There are real reasons why we might think that, but it's also not a super useful overarching idea for us. So let's keep it in mind, but bracket it as well. There's also this idea of India as a new Asian tiger, as a rising economy or economic zone that's going to transform the 21st century. I think there's also something to this, but it's important that we don't get carried away with ourselves as we move forward. So again, let's keep these images in mind. They're important. They've structured different thinking about India, and they continue to structure our thinking today. But let's try to free ourselves from some of those visions as well. One of the ways in which we can do this, I think, is simply by flipping the map of the Indian subcontinent on its head and inverting some of our ideas about the subcontinent. This is an idea, and this is a map that comes to us courtesy of a really great South Asian magazine called Himalaya, based in Kathmandu in Nepal. And I love thinking about the region like this, flipping around and turning over ideas that we've had and held tightly in the past. So let's try to keep that inversion in mind as we work through the birth of Indian civilization starting next time. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.